everyone. I'm Sahil Agarwal, co-founder and CEO at Enkrypt. With me, we have today Josh Geltzer, partner at WilmerHale, and our Chief Security Officer, Merritt Baer, on the podcast with us.
Hi, Josh. Why don't you give us your quick origin story? Because I feel like you've had a really interesting tenure / direction and what keeps you excited about these issues and anything else you want to share.
That sounds great. And thank you both for the chance to join you for this conversation. So I've been a partner in Wilmer's DC office for about 6 months now. I'm in the Defense and National Security Group and very focused on AI related issues, technology issues. The interest in working this area stemmed in part from my most recent job in government. So I spent the last year and a half of the Biden administration as the Deputy White House Counsel and legal advisor to the National Security Council. So that meant I handled national security, foreign policy issues with a team of lawyers at the White House. And unlike when I had been in that same office about a decade earlier, AI was, if not everywhere, at least in many places. And the issues were fascinating. The intelligence community had AI issues. The Defense Department had AI issues. The White House itself had AI issues for how it operated and ran. And so as I had the chance to move to private practice, I really wanted to keep working on these issues. Before that role, served in various other roles in government, including as Deputy Homeland Security Advisor earlier in the Biden administration, and at the White House and at the Justice Department in the Obama administration. I've also taught at Georgetown Law, taught national security law there, and run an institute that did and continues to do now constitutional litigation.
It's awesome.
I'll give the full disclaimer here, and Sahil gets next rights on questions here because we're being really informal and fun, which is the goal. But like Sahil is a PhD in math. I happen to have a law degree, but I didn't want to go work on security issues from the legal angle because I felt constrained by some of the business models around what lawyers are supposed to be doing when they're working. And I felt like it wasn't, creative is the wrong word, but like it wasn't freeform enough for me to be good, not at the issues themselves, but at the business model of how you get good at it. I'm curious how you have been able to, because I think you're just like a fascinating, in full disclosure, Josh and I have known each other for years and we've kind of looked up to each other, I think. But like, I've been impressed by how you've been able to find some of the most interesting jobs while being people's lawyer. Tell me more about why you care about that aspect.
I like being that counselor, that lawyer, that person who works with whomever it might be, a strategist or policymaker in government, a client, whether a private sector entity or a nonprofit entity in a role like I'm in now, and helps them see their way between where they are and wherever they want to go, whether it's big picture or small. We want to start using AI as part of our business model, or we are an AI company and want to navigate the regulatory regime. But either way, to be a guide along that pathway and to be able to articulate risks and benefits, because there are clear prohibitions in law, there are clear thou shalt nots, but especially in an area that's evolving, murky, like this one, and those are good things because they also mean interesting, to help articulate risks and benefits and to help be a thought partner in getting from here to there and identifying issue spotting, as lawyers tend to call it, along the way, ultimately counseling and offering both legal judgment and kind of prudence as well. I really enjoy that.
Well, we're somewhat of different people, but I'm also kind of curious about this. I think, so I'm going to pull you on this and then I'm going to yield the floor to Sal a little. I actually think, because especially at the beginning of my career, folks were like, we're going to need a whole new regime of law to deal with cyber. And I was like, not really. You still can't stalk her and go kill her, even though we see this happening all the time with, femicide. You still can't, whatever, insert the crime, right? Like, you still can't steal money. We don't call that cyber crime. We call it crime. Like, there are ways in which I think some of the standards that we want to maintain are if not evergreen, are like something that we work at, the way that we aspire to care about values-driven decisions in any company or in any enterprise. I think of the American experiment as an enterprise in itself, right? Like that we are working on a shared set of values that we continue to reinforce, and that's kind of true across the world on some level. Like, what makes for a successful project at getting good at what stays the same and what's changing, and how do you know when to push on something?
I think you're right in terms of how to look at it. And I think to some extent, those who enjoy, and I say this with admiration, but those who enjoy the exercise of wholly reimagining, wholly rethinking, they, I think, tend to write, teach, places where there is blank space to write. And we all learn from it. But I think if you're in the trenches day to day in the sort of roles I have been in and I'm in now, instead you work within the existing law. You don't get to say, if one reimagined the law around AI, it would look like X. Instead you say, well, how do we take existing privacy law? How do we take existing aiding and abetting liability? How do we take existing intellectual property law and try to figure out how to fit old law onto new facts, or maybe it's new facts into old law, which is often the exercise of a lawyer in common law systems. This may be more interesting, maybe even harder at times, when the new facts involve brand new technologies. But I also think it makes it super interesting, and to have the perspective of acknowledging that it's novel to fit those together, and to help clients, whether those clients were clients in government, meaning my colleagues, or clients in the private sector now, acknowledging that how it all turns out big picture is unsettled, so that one needs to plan for contingencies in which the way one thinks it should be thought about isn't what the courts of appeals end up saying, or the US Supreme Court ends up saying. Do think that needs to be baked into tackling things at this stage. But that's still different from saying, shred it all, let's just reimagine law in an AI era. I don't think that's much of a guide. I agree.
Yeah, and I think that as a follow-up to that, one of the things that we keep coming across is people saying we need more regulation on AI, we need like new laws. I mean, countries around the world are thinking about how they want to regulate AI. Whereas what we're seeing from customers or from enterprises is what they're already worried about is, am I going to violate the existing regulations that apply to me, right? Whether I'm in financial services or insurance or tax or retail or whatever. To the earlier point by Merritt is, you still can't steal money itself, right? It's a crime. It's not just about stealing it from physically or stealing it from a bank, like from a digital perspective. And I think that applies to AI itself. And when you work with your clients or in your peer group, how are people thinking about this aspect?
I think you're right that there still needs to be grappling with the regime, no matter whether it's new law, new court decisions, wherever it comes from. I think entities, governments, commentators are asking should the regime be. I'll give an example here that shows that the question may be the same, even if the actors kind of leading the way and offering answers are different. So here in the United States, obviously conversations of great consequence happening with respect to intellectual property and AI, and in particular whether it does or doesn't qualify as fair use for model developers to train their models on copyrighted materials. Now,
the $1.5 million question or more.
Yeah. That was the sort of number I had in mind when I was using the word consequential there, and I was justified, although maybe an understatement. But here in the US, as is often the case in the US, the conversation is being duked out, at least so far, primarily in courtrooms. Private litigation, civil litigation, private parties, and federal judges issuing rulings somewhat different that will percolate presumably up on appeal over time. Now, in Europe, there is a similar conversation going on, much more in the legislature, which of course it could be here too. One could legislate around these issues, but either way, people are asking the same underlying question, which is, what is fair use, what is not fair use, how does that apply to model developers who want their models to reach as widely as possible in their training data. And so in some ways, it is the outcome and then an ability to orient around it that entities are looking for. And the pathway, whether that's duking it out in court or whether that's seeking legislation of one form or another, it's leading to a grappling with the same basic questions of law and the same desire to have an understanding of the premises on which AI development will then proceed.
Maybe. I don't know that I agree with that, because I actually think when I talk to my European counterparts, who are like the chief security officer at an AI company, they will literally, you talk to a German CISO and they will say, so I know that my data is mine. And I'm like, whoa. I'm not saying I disagree with you as a human. I'm just saying I don't see protections for that in the rights that are observed in the country that I reside in. Like there are different baseline expectations, and there's also different kind of nation, or even, as you know, like, what's the word for like proximity to nation principles that look different in different places. And I think we're seeing AI sort of encapsulate some of these. And this was true so first of all, I tried to ignore international law for as long as possible because I was like, who's going to enforce it? I'm not sure it's a real thing. Again, I've never actually been anyone's lawyer.
Have you come around now?
Kind of. I mean, oil spills and like the chip shortage are getting me a little bit closer. Also, hot wars will help you understand that NATO, if not law, is very powerful. You know what I mean? Like, I think that I still actually know I'm pretty stubborn about the fact that I don't think international law is the same as national law. I also think that because it has different motivations, I think having North Stars around your use of data, and actually I'm going to put Sahil on the spot after this, because as someone who works on sort of like an internal project, which is not a nation, but it is a company. Well, I guess I work on both on some level, but like one of the things that I push Sahil on is the nation building kind of sense of what North Stars are we going to live by? How will process be part of what we deliver? And by that, I mean, it is, as Wendell Berry would say, like, I do not know exactly the outcome, but I know the way. I think part of what we committed to as America, for example, was this idea that there would be a commitment, and we literally then ended up putting an amendment in there that made it due process. But I think we had this idea that process is more repeatable over time than a particular good outcome. So I'm curious how you see, Josh, this is, I guess, I've become one of those annoying guys who shows up in my talks. This is a two-part question. One is for Josh around like, how do you see repeatability or lack thereof in terms of the good that people are after, and especially in different countries? And then Sahil, how do you perceive that as a company founder in terms of like parallels with what you go for that like should constrain you and that you choose to be constrained by?
I am really struck by, I think, a dimension of this in talking with clients and in trying to understand the space, because the point about repeatability and the point about process and what has been developed as emergent law in, let's say, the social media space now maps onto the AI space, it is coming at people quickly. The evolution in how Americans and others interact with AI chatbots is remarkable. I know we were all, I think, found it quite remarkable how swiftly social media became integrated into daily life and into the headspace of Americans. That is happening at least as fast and probably with even greater consequence for some, at some ages in particular, with AI chatbots. They are a kind of other voice in one's head. They are a constant companion of sorts with whom one, goes back and forth on as little a thing as, what to eat for lunch or a snack, and as big a thing as really, really consequential decisions, including ones about harm or even self-harm that have obviously made it into the news lately because of the stakes of what comes back during chatbot engagement during when that gets raised by a user. But all of this points to Merritt, your I think rightful emphasis on needing to think about this not just as a time slice, as a moment in time, as to the best or worst output of a particular frontier model now, but instead as a system of what will it be like as these iterate, maybe more quickly, maybe less quickly, but they certainly will continue to iterate and get better. How do we think about it? How do we think about it from the perspective of users who will want to be able to say, well, I know that my engagement thousands of times a day is or is not being used in these ways, is being protected or not being protected, shared with government or not being shared with government, recoverable by me if I want it or not recoverable by me. And those are all process things that I think are still being, they're still in flux at this early stage.
Yeah, that was literally my note to myself was, are they real? Go on, Sahil.
Yeah. And I think from a process perspective, as well as a company building aspect around this, one of the things is, and to Josh's point as well, like with all the self-harm, not all the self-harm, but like aspects of self-harm that we've seen in AI and chatbots, from targeting minors to actually knowingly not removing minor exploitation, like exploiting minors for certain things, from whether that's child sexual exploitation or others. I think the speed of iteration is actually sort of becoming a blocker to make or take the right steps towards responsible AI, as we've seen. But what countries and nations are realizing is it's not just that's affecting their society, it's also affecting national security from a supply chain perspective, from a dominance perspective, and what is going to be, who is going to be leading the AI race. And that becomes a huge thing in the next years to come. But from a company building perspective, from a process perspective, what we help our customers or what we help our clients is essentially figure out what does next 30 days look like, and what does next year looks like. Because of, again, it's the speed of iteration that's driving everyone nuts and keeping everyone awake at night, just so that like people can continue to focus on what matters for their business, for their customers, and so on and so forth, rather than just trying to be abreast about everything that's happening in AI.
Yeah, I was actually about to like push you on that though. Like, don't your toddlers keep you up at night or nothing at all? Like, I don't know that the state of AI is what keeps you up at night. I actually just think it is on part of a level. Part of me is like, isn't this the work that company building or nation building or that like family building looks like? To come up with a set of values, to try to live by them, to try to crystallize them into something that makes a framework that you live by, even when you don't love the situation.
It is.
But then it becomes more defensible or repeatable over time.
It absolutely is. And I think like the point I was trying to make was
because I know you and I know that like the state of AI isn't what keeps you up. It's like
I mean, it's obviously it's obviously
the rest of us. Like, you know more than probably a lot of folks do about how AI works, and you're like, right, it's not perfect. That's exactly why we work on it.
Right.
And how we feel about America too, you know.
Yeah, and I think it's that aspect of knowing how bad things can get if we don't have the right measures around it is the aspect of building the business, and why we see a lot of companies not using or not being very prudent about building it responsibly. That's part of the business building aspect. But the point is, we see companies knowingly ignore those risks, which also become like where we essentially put a stake in the ground and say, this is not something that we will let pass or let them ignore. And we are very upfront about those responsible disclosures or any other risk aspect, which in some cases we knowingly are antagonistic to them, and that's fine, because it's not something that we can just let it pass for anyone else.
You're talking about both companies that are using AI models as the underpinning for their something that might surface at the content layers, for example, unacceptable content, including child sexual abuse or other unacceptable material, but also folks who are developing these models
Exactly.
who are doing unacceptable development patterns. Am I correct?
Yeah. Exactly. It's all through the stack, and that affects us as a society, and that affects us as a nation with respect to what are the values that we're putting in the society today, or not.
Josh, I'm curious what your experience has been, both with like whether those values are, I don't think just data privacy, but like how you see across, clients and conversations and multinational companies around different regimes, but also around those shared responsibility elements of the stack. Like, are folks mad at Sam Altman? Like, what does it matter if OpenAI gets it wrong? How would they experience it? What does it look like for you as a lawyer to help advise them? I'm very curious what it looks like on the ground.
Well, there's a lot there, and maybe I'll start with the beginning of that question, which I think you phrased beautifully, which is in some ways there are constellations of values that in government, from this seat, I think a lot of people at AI companies are grappling with. Is privacy there? Yes. Is it more than privacy? Yes. It's things like agency and autonomy implicated by this remarkable technology, or really technologies, and what they can do, and then the subsidiary question of what they should do. But I agree that privacy is a part and not the only part, and I think some of those other values and how to think about them, including in choices about where to embed AI and what to do with its outputs, and where humans do or don't continue to exercise discretion over the outputs, they implicate a lot of those other values as well. I mean, in terms of questions we get from clients, I do think, especially those that are deploying AI for the first time, integrating it into their business models, their efficiencies, often their questions do begin with the privacy question, in part because, and this goes back to an earlier part of this conversation, there's a concreteness of law in the privacy space that may not exist for, let's say, agency or autonomy vis-a-vis artificial intelligence and humans. So because there's a concreteness of it, they know to ask, and they're right to do so. And we as their lawyers have sources of law we can look at that at least map on more neatly to say, okay, under X federal law, X state law, based on X court decision, so long as you disclose this, we think you're able to start deploying it this way. So long as you update your privacy policy or terms of service or whatever it may be, we think we can't identify any law you'd be violating to start having AI make recommendations at scale about X, Y, Z outputs. But the questions about that maybe relate to agency or autonomy, I think are they're still nascent, they're still forming, but I think you're right to point to those as values. And I also think they implicate they will evolve over time, because questions about, let's say, culpability, liability when something goes wrong, as with all areas when you're trying to assign culpability when something goes wrong, it depends on kind of who knew and did what along a causal chain, which will itself evolve as we all learn more about these technologies. So this is going to oversimplify, but if you imagine an AI developer, and then maybe AI model augmenter for a particular purpose, and then ultimately an AI deployer, and then a particular user, any one of those can do something that may later lead someone to say, I don't know what happened here, but I know that there was an outcome that was unacceptable. And who gets blamed for it will depend upon who knew what along that chain, who knew the ultimate use, who disregarded earlier advice about appropriate, inappropriate uses as that chain, as you go kind of downstream along that pathway. But my point is, as we and those along that chain understand more, it actually affects, as it always does, kind of the who knew what question that can be at least a core feature of assigning liability, culpability.
Well, you're leading me into an interesting CISO conversation that we're having now, which is, are we waiting for enforcement? And Sal kind of referred to this earlier with a little bit of, well, I call it ostriching. When people are like, I know that AI is coming, I just haven't, and it's like, okay, I mean, I don't know when it will become the thing that you either get fired or don't get fired for. Like, I'm not your rabbi or your mom. Like, I can't tell you what to do or not do here. But what I can tell you is that I think that in the course of the last 10 years, what we've seen is a lot of enforcement-based approaches. So, for example, people know, no one said, oh, wow, I'm pretty sure that the NIST framework is the perfect approach. But you know what they did say? Guess what, Wyndham? You didn't do it. Ashley Madison, whatever. And this was, you could take the FTC, you could take the SEC, you can take the DOJ with Joe Sullivan and Uber. Like, we just have seen it, at least in the US, come through in the form of enforcement actions. We saw in the EU too, and then rising. But of course, the EU goes a little more, I would say, like early stage with, I wouldn't say defining, but certainly like putting out guidance around it. Anyway, I'm curious what you think will be the wave that folks might have to ride around. So I'm going to give you a situation which is very common for us. We have a medium to large size enterprise, could be public, could be private, it kind of doesn't matter. And they say, we know that we need to be doing more about AI, both on the innovation side and on the security side. We just don't know exactly what. And no one has come and told me. So I'm worried that if I make a move, it will be the wrong move. I will tell you that my initial response is, do you already have a customer facing chatbot? Because you've already made the move. You know what I mean? Like, some of what I'm trying to do is actually get in the trenches here around like situations that you see. But I'm curious because this is a stage that I see a lot of folks at. Like, I know that we only get so many 6-minute increments for free with a law firm partner. I'm curious what you're telling people now.
Well, first of all, I tell people both professionally but also personally the point you just made, which is if you think you're not interacting with AI, you just don't realize that you're interacting with AI. And there are, particularly, you both are more sophisticated technologically than I am, but the example that I make to people less sophisticated even than I is just, hey, do you use Google? Do you read the initial results that now show up before the hyperlinks, which are quite useful often, and many people do? And I said, you realize those are AI generated encapsulations of some of the most prominent hyperlinks. And if so, you're reading AI output with your, as you look at responses to Google searches. So I agree with you that there is, your chatbot example is a good one as well, given the prevalence of those in our interactions with customer service or internal to companies. People who work at big companies often find that their resources are internally accessible via AI-powered chatbots. I agree with the premise that people are already interacting with.
It's literally almost impossible to permission every link correctly. I mean, the idea of like
everywhere to begin with.
Environment, you know what I mean? Like, I think these come back to core security principles, which, while aspirational, are really hard to enforce. Which I think I didn't want to stray from your point, but I think that most folks who think of themselves as security practitioners don't realize that they are AI practitioners too. Now, anyway, keep going.
No, but so then I'm going to now circle back to your question about sort of, is it okay to wait for enforcement, or to think of enforcement as the really bad day? And for that, I have a maybe strong answer, probably not surprising answer of no. There are bad days that do not involve DOJ enforcement, or even for that matter, FTC or SEC or someone else with enforcement authority. There are bad days that involve congressional investigations or media reporting or user disclosures or whistleblower
Or
disclosures.
just outages. Yeah.
Or outages, right? In various directions, there are days in which not having, from your perspective, Merritt, a kind of security protocol, from my perspective, a kind of internal governance framework for responsible use, for the absence of those can cause really tough, really bad days long before you're in the sights of DOJ or a state attorney general or law enforcement. And to think about doing this responsibly in the face of all those potential bad days, that shouldn't strike fear. It should instead yield kind of prudence and forethought. But I do think there are many things short of full-blown criminal or civil investigation that should still motivate kind of getting one's AI house in order now rather than waiting. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. And just going back to your experience over the last couple of years, I know like in your previous role with the Biden administration, advising them on national security, and in the last 6 months or a year or so on the private side, what's the difference you're seeing from the government side? And concretely, just to put some perspective, you had the AI safety regulation come out from Biden administration. The current administration scrapped that and recently put out the AI Action Plan for America, which is not focused on safety, but how do we bring the U.S. at the forefront of leading the AI revolution for everyone. But there's a very targeted section on bias even within the AI Action Plan, whereas it scrapped all other safety or security measures. So, what is your view on the government enforcing or not enforcing, but it's still how are they guiding companies on AI?
I think there are strands of continuity and strands of discontinuity across the two administrations. I think in some ways the biggest area of notable change, in part because of its prominence, in part because of the actual level of change, is with respect to export controls. And you had the Biden administration, towards the end of the administration, issue the AI global diffusion rule that was geared towards, for higher end semiconductors, for the closed model weights associated with at least higher end models, putting the world into three tiers, three categories of countries, and kind of in particular holding back some of the higher end stuff from some of the countries that the countries that the U.S. government might view as adversaries or at least rivals. That was revoked by the Trump administration. There has not yet been, at least so far, a new diffusion rule, despite initial kind of indications there would be. But there have been deals bilaterally with particular governments, so maybe it's multilaterally in that companies, U.S. companies, have been involved as well, such as during the president's trip to the Emirates and to Saudi Arabia, that suggest a very different approach. There's also been updates by the Department of Commerce, by BAS in particular, to allow the sale of pretty sophisticated, pretty high-end chips. So I think that's a notable change. On the other hand, I think some of the areas the change has been maybe more rhetorical than substantive. I mean, the AI Safety Institute within NIST at the Department of Commerce, it was renamed as KAICI, but it's still in existence. And the AI Action Plan even calls for it and other parts of the U.S. government to still do AI testing and AI assessments for at least catastrophic risk, high-end risk, things in the national security context. I also think some of what the current administration is emphasizing rhetorically actually was a point of emphasis for the prior administration as well. So if you look at even before the AI Action Plan came out, Trump 2's Office of Management and Budget put out a couple of memos on government adoption of AI that looked quite similar to the Biden era memos that they supplanted. There were slight tweaks here and there, but overall, I actually see the push for the executive branch to get in the game better and faster, to look a little bit more like the U.S. private sector, which is always going to be nimbler and innovate faster than the government, but to kind of in certain areas pick up the pace, adopt this technology, use it responsibly, be transparent with the American people about how it's being used, but not fall behind. That to me strikes as maybe an acceleration of that push, but not not a stark U-turn. So I think it's complex. Within the AI space, I think some strands are kind of being pulled forward, some are new, but that's in part because there's so much to AI policy as a whole that it's hard to characterize writ large.
Absolutely.
Okay, I'm going to be a little bit of a jerk here. How much do you think? I don't think it's actually critical that every person who's writing AI policy be, a math PhD from Yale. But I do think that we're seeing some, we talked earlier about sort of the dynamics between public-private. I see open source and private companies having different dynamics in the area of AI than we've ever seen before in terms of dynamics around responsible disclosures or around like some of the relationships here, which feel established, are actually taking on new forms. So, for example, Microsoft taking such a strong interest in OpenAI, I don't want to say polluted, but it converted their interests in a way that felt more traditional in a private sector sense. You've referred to both criminal and civil elements of what you work on. I'm curious if you see the dynamics between the relationships and frankly, like the fact that a lot of the open source models that underpin, so the fact that open source models that underpin almost every functionality, including ChatGPT or whatever, like if it's not DeepSeek, then it's basically an American open source model that might be underpinning your car rental customer-facing chatbot. Do you see that as a unique dynamic in advising them around responsibility models and or in other ways that folks should approach their criminal and or civil responsibility here?
It is such an interesting question. It's particularly salient as a question given the aforementioned AI action plan. And
well, I like to give you softballs, so
What's that?
I like to give softballs, No, I'm actually being very indulgent. I have been thinking about this, like just what's new here. What does it look like?
Here there seems to be, again, given that the Trump administration has I think emphasized, I don't know if sided with is the right characterization, but certainly emphasized open source in the action plan. I think there is a question of what the implications are for the security side of things, which also gets paid homage in the action plan. It's there. There is a articulated concern about the most sophisticated versions of models reaching global competitors, losing what gets kind of alluded to, described in the action plan as an American edge that is hard to define and may prove finite. It may not exist forever, so how to maximize it while it exists. That's all in there too. I'm not sure there's a totally fully articulated theory of the case of what it means to go all in on open source for models to get better and better and better, and ensure that they won't then be accessible to those who would not use them for the good purposes for which U.S. companies tend to develop them, or at least try to restrain them to. But I'm with you that it sort of injects an extra puzzle to the security dimension when the guts of it are at least available in that way.
Sahil, I know you have thoughts on here. I'm going to tap you in for a minute.
Yeah. I think what we're seeing is, because how powerful all these models are, it's essentially giving the same tools to enterprises who want to build these customer-facing chatbots or for internal productivity, but it's also giving bad actors the tools which are almost there, right? Like now the bad actors don't actually have to build a whole stack of applications to actually being able to adversarially attack your systems. But I think that the aspect of open source that a lot of regulatory bodies are concerned about is you're giving them access to everything that they need to adversarially or just attack your systems itself. And is that something that you see policymakers or legislators being concerned about actively? Or another aspect from open source perspective is how much of this depends, how much of building open source systems is actually driving adoption, whether like for your clients or your customers or the government, versus just making sure that we are solely putting all our chips in just a few developers or AI developers who are building state-of-the-art systems today.
Hang on, I want to clarify a couple things that maybe Sahil, you can't, like, do you mean open source in the sense that DeepSeek can steal the way that we developed it and then create their own model? Or do you mean open source in the sense that, like, Vietnamese developer can just create their own version of, are you talking about the models themselves, Sal, or are you talking about the outputs?
So I'm talking about the models themselves, where what capabilities available through a closed source model versus an open source model, and then how's that driving adoption, and how's that also driving the bad actors?
I'm going to zoom out, maybe to make a point that's too simplistic, but I'll do it anyway because it certainly struck us while we were in government. It strikes me now that I'm in working with companies in the private sector, which is, put aside for a second open source or closed model weights. The sheer fact that this remarkably consequential, potentially kind of humanity-altering technology has been developed in the private sector and is in the hands of the private sector, it's just worth dwelling on that, because we've all internalized that as normal. That is the state of affairs, and so far as I can tell, it will remain the state of affairs for at least foreseeable future. But that's not like, for example, nuclear technology, which got developed by the government, then became a heavily regulated industry or sector with the thought that to the extent the private sector moves in, there's a lot of safety to be thought about, a lot of security to be thought about. This has come differently. It's emerged from the private sector. The government, to the extent it's using AI, and as I mentioned, I think it's working hard to kind of accelerate that, is taking commercially available models and then adapting or using. It's not recreating its own. And this sophisticated stuff is being birthed and living outside government. And so I think that in and of itself is a different approach to technology with security and safety implications of this magnitude from what we've experienced before. And we're sort of grappling with that, I think, at scale.
Okay, fine, but government is part of the world that it is slurping up, and if it's allowed to. I mean, depending on the internet and whatever universe that you're exposed to internet in. And then also, I think we are not quite clear on what the dynamic is. Like, what does OpenAI owe the universe versus, like, there was something clearer here. And maybe this is a good place for you to give some kind of like closing thoughts around, like, not just, I think that Sahil and I would agree that, like, what we are spending our life on right now is making sure that models don't betray us. That, like, they serve the folks who they were created for. And by were created for, I mean, it could be making sure that your, housing unit is able to give you the answers to your questions so that your fifth grader can understand how to get access to the key. Like, there are a lot of really wonderful, like, ordinary, but also extraordinary use cases around the use of AI. Part of what we work on day to day, though, all of us, is like the stuff that just goes off the rails. And my concern is, or my question revolves around, which gods do we serve? So if we are looking at, a Sam Altman who now works for Microsoft, like, is it the open source community? Is it the private sector? Is it any other person who might come in as sort of like an in-between, who might be from, we see golf champions moving to Dubai. Like, where do we see loyalties, and how would we know when they serve them?
A good question. In the interest of wrapping up succinctly, I'll give a short and insufficient answer, which is from at least the seat I sit in, what we can counsel and often are encouraged by clients to do is at least work through that internally and externally. Now, the answer is going to differ. Different corporate identities, different nonprofit identities, different personal identities. But to answer that internally with an approach to AI that's thought through and defensible, even on those days where things go awry, and to try to be as transparent with users, governments, public as that, that's at least a big start.
Honestly, we wrapped where we began, which is like reasonable, attestable, defensible, which is also verbiage that many agencies like, which I just think is fair, like, yeah. There is some, I don't know that everyone who's not a lawyer really realizes that reasonableness is literally a legal standard. So we just keep redefining it. And I think that's the project that we're on.
I think just, yeah.
Yeah, so.
I just said that great points, Josh and Merritt. Like, loved the conversation, and one of the key takeaways is, as long as we're not ostriching, as long as we're putting our heads in the sand and saying that let things pass. I think being cognizant of about the risks and the opportunities, that's like that as a society is something that we should strive for and continue to work on.
Sure. Motherhood and apple pie, so no, I'm just teasing you. No, let's do this. It's a project. We're all in it together. And also, there are elements of each of these that matter the same way that it did with encryption or other things, where like the technical characteristics speak to, but do not dictate how we use these in the world. So thank you so much. And Josh, thank you for the time.
Thank you both. This was a great conversation and
we'll
great fun to be part of.
Send you our invoice for 6-minute increments.
This was a treat to do. Thank you both for it.
You're such a trooper, and thank you, and thanks, Sahil.
Thank you, Merritt. Thank you, Josh.
Thank you both.
Bye.